Good afternoon. I'm Earl Butch Graves, Jr., CEO of Black Enterprise, and it's my privilege to welcome you to our all-new Black Enterprise Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Summit. First, let's take stock of where we stand in 2022. While it may seem like a decade has passed, it has been just 2 years since the murder of George Floyd forced a national reckoning on race. The conversation played out passionately in the media, in the political arena, and on our nation's streets, which saw the largest protests since the height of the civil rights movement. Corporate America included its voice in this moment as well. We have heard powerful statements of solidarity with victims of racism, assertions from the C-suite that yes, Black lives matter. Most importantly, we received investment pledges across all industries with renewed commitments to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Individually and collectively, companies vowed to deliver access and resources to African Americans to enhance career mobility and expand equitable entrepreneurial opportunities. That was then. What about now? Has corporate America actually made good on any of those lofty promises? That's why Black Enterprise, the #1 Black digital media brand with more than 10 million monthly unique visitors, developed today's summit to answer such questions and fully dissect corporate America's agenda. We've invited world-class executives and thought leaders to discuss African American representation and participation at all levels. Together, we will evaluate and examine DEI as an integral part of its business imperative and its effectiveness when measured against recent pledges to address systemic discrimination. To what degree do we see the development of new strategies to accelerate recruitment, retention, and elevation of Black talent? And what steps will be taken to truly make the DEI charge intentional, measurable, and transformative? Through our series of sessions, this summit intends to provide much more than a DEI report card, but a playbook full of useful information and insights to facilitate Black professional and business success. You'll learn how to strategically position yourself for opportunity and advancement, build career networks, and yes, navigate institutional racism when it rears its ugly head. Before we get started, I would like to extend my appreciation to our long-term partner, Toyota, for its sponsorship and investment in this exclusive first-class virtual summit. I want to thank all of you, our audience, for joining us for this important event on today's rapidly changing landscape. To kick off our summit, Dingle, our Executive Vice President and Chief Content Officer, will moderate our Chief Diversity Officers Roundtable, an expansive conversation on how business leadership must ensure that DEI becomes and remains an unshakable tenet of corporate culture. Derek?
Thanks, Butch. Now I would like to kick off our DEI Summit with our first session, Chief Diversity Officers Roundtable, How DEI Impacts Corporate Culture. I'm Derek Dingle, Executive Vice President and Chief Content Officer of Black Enterprise. To discuss this timely and relevant topic, we have brought together two of the foremost leaders who drive these vital efforts. Here to discuss how the renewed focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion has changed the corporate environment, as well as the status of Black executives, managers, suppliers, and stakeholders, are Angela Bretz, Senior Vice President and Chief Diversity and Talent Acquisition Officer for Nationwide, and Reginald Miller, Vice President and Global Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer for McDonald's. Angela, Reggie, thank you for joining our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Summit.
Thank you for having us.
Yes, thank you for having us.
Well, I think the area of and the role of the Chief Diversity Officer has been one that has been asked of us by our audience repeatedly. And we have the great fortune of having both of you joining us to share with us specifically what that role entails. So to start us off, I'd like you to share in your CDO capacity, what is your role? How do you shape DEI strategy and implement DEI policy, and the expansive nature of what you do day to day for your companies? So Angela, we're going to start with you, and tell us, what is your role as CDO of Nationwide?
So thank you, Derek. My role as CDO at Nationwide really involves everything, diversity, equity, and inclusion. That's the policies, the practices, the procedures, and the implementation and oversight of all the policies, practices, and procedures. That includes in the workplace, so think of our workforce, and that is the representation. And it also, in the workplace, it's our culture, it's our inclusive culture. And then it extends beyond Nationwide for four walls into the community. And so that's our brand and reputation and how we show up and are active in the communities across the country.
Okay, thank you, Angela. Reggie?
Yeah, I mean, I would mirror a lot of things that Angela said. And one of the interesting things that maybe not many people think about when they think about a chief diversity officer role is just how many hats that you need to wear. You need to be analytical and be able to measure trends within your workforce representation, within your engagement survey and inclusion index potentially. And so that's one element of the job. Secondly, you're a communications and PR person, really trying to showcase the representation of the company in ways in which the external audience can see exactly the work that you're doing, as Angela mentioned, in the community and in other ways as well. And then the third, I'll mention just very briefly, is that advisor to your senior leadership team, really trying to shape and transform the culture, whether that's directly with the senior leadership team and the CEO, or obviously even with the board of directors within your organization as well. And so that's only three of many roles and hats that you have to play as a chief diversity officer, as well as implement a strategy, change the culture, all the things that Angela said.
Yeah.
Wow.
And Derek, if I may, real quick, because this question I get quite a bit from those wanting to enter the chief diversity officer role. And I think, they see us traveling to different DEI events throughout the country, and they think that that is a big or a huge component of the work. And to that, I will say, yes, we do get to travel, but that probably makes up about 20% of what it is we really do. So I don't want anyone to think that the role of a CDO is simply to travel. It's more than public relations or just attending different events.
Okay. Well, I think the reason why that question is asked so much, especially today, is because we're now in the, for lack of a better term, post-George Floyd era. We know that in the aftermath of the George Floyd tragedy and the unrest, the ensuing unrest, that many corporations, or a myriad of corporations, made corporate commitments to focus on racial equity, to focus on addressing past racial inequities, looking at advancement of African Americans specifically, within the corporation and in business in general, and also impacting the community. So having said that, has the role of diversity, equity, and inclusion changed dramatically since that those commitments have been made in 2020 to today? And if it has changed, how has it impacted the culture of your company as well as corporate Americas in general?
I'll start by just saying, for the role of the CDO, the role hasn't really changed that much, especially for those who have been really intent about driving change within their work. Although the intention and the focus has definitely changed. Because really the role, as we outlined before, really speaks to how to do the work authentically. When you're doing the work around really driving culture change, one, it's not something that can happen just overnight, but two, it really has to be authentic and realistic as I think about the right way to engage any specific demographic, whether we're talking about African Americans or others throughout the course of your engagement. And so, to the way that Angela described it earlier, she talked about practices that really engage with the African American community, practices that engage with, how to really go after the wealth gap, and in ways in which maybe her company, as well as my company, is trying to address that. As of course, what do you do around representation within your company, and how do you create spaces that are comfortable for African Americans to join your organization? And so that work has been ongoing, I would say, throughout my entire time as a CDO, even though the attention around it may have changed in the last couple of years.
Yeah, and I would certainly echo that, Reggie. I don't know that the role has changed much since the tragic death of George Floyd, Derek. At Nationwide, we've been on this journey, and it is absolutely a journey for a number of years. We've had a CDO role in an Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion since 2005. Now, since the death of George Floyd and the social unrest that has really ensued and that we've been living with since, have we done things differently? I think we've operated with even greater intentionality around what it is we're wanting to do. I mean, soon after George Floyd, we did publicly reassert our commitment to social justice and did additional multi-year and multi-million-dollar investments in social justice organizations. But we were already on that path. So I think we're operating with greater intention and purpose would be the change that I would highlight.
So in terms of the greater intention and purpose, how do you look at the metrics of specific programs and initiatives internally? And I'm speaking specifically about African Americans within the corporation, because so much of the pledges that were made 2 years ago focused on specifically African Americans, and of course we're Black enterprise. But what are the areas that you expanded, and what are the metrics to ensure success? And if you're not hitting the measurements, how do you go about the process of course correcting in terms of your objectives with specific initiatives and policies?
So I can certainly.
Angela, I'll start with you, and then I'll have Reggie respond.
So we track our progress through an annual engagement survey and an inclusiveness index. And we're very fortunate in that we have very vocal associates. And so if our associates see some gaps, they bring that to our attention. And I frankly, I love that. I love that they feel comfortable enough being that transparent with us. And where we have gaps, we put in plans and processes to get after those gaps. And there is an accountability component. We have an annual CEO scorecard, and that's where we monitor our progress on our diverse representation. And every one of our associates across Nationwide, individual contributor and leaders alike, have an objective that relates to building our culture of inclusion. And our board also has annual meetings with each of our OCEO members, and they have to go over their people strategy. And a part of that people strategy is their DE&I work, and the representation is certainly a component of that.
So when you have those meetings, and Reggie, I'll have you follow up. When you have those meetings, can you give us a little more or elaborate on them? How are those meetings structured, and then what comes out of those meetings to further direct managers or the company as a whole?
So it's called progress and accountability. So you don't want to go to that meeting not really having some movement and some solid plans in place from the last time you were there. And if that is the case, then you're challenged on that and ask questions about, so help me understand why this number, this metric hasn't moved since the last time we were together. And I want to see succinct and clear plans as to what it is you were going to do to move this meter.
Reggie, how has McDonald's expanded its approach to DEI over the last 2 years? What have been the metrics for success? And if you've been challenged in meeting certain metrics, how do you go about course correcting?
Sure. To build a little bit on what Angela talked about a little earlier, one of the things that was really important to us was really going after metrics. So last February, we launched our strategy, and our strategy was focused around not only making our DEI efforts holistic, but also holding our senior leadership team accountable. And so we did that around 4 specific metrics. 2 were representation based, 2 were indices. The representation goals was one around the increased number of women at the senior director and above levels, and that was a global metric. And then the one around underrepresented groups was also at the senior director and above levels, and we put 2025 and 2030 goals around that. And then our indices were focused in on specifically our values within the company, and we do that through a pulse engagement survey on an annual basis, as well as an inclusion index. And then throughout the year, we had a number of different additional checkpoints that also added accountability and metrics around our DEI space. So one that was focused in around our supplier diversity efforts. And so our mutual commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, not only balanced between increasing supplier spend, but also increasing the number of diverse suppliers as well. And then we moved on from there into going specifically and targeting goals around our marketing groups and spend that we want to increase specifically within the African American community there as well. And so we switched from there, where we went from both the 15% accountability for our officer group in regards to those 4 indices that I talked about, to supplier diversity, then move forward into pay equity, where we focused in on making sure that we had pay equity, not just domestically around the globe. And it wasn't just focused on pay equity for women, it also was focused on pay equity for underrepresented groups as well. And then we closed out the year with a commitment to increasing the diversity of our franchisee and owner-operator group as well, with investments in that space. And so this idea that there was metrics and accountability all throughout the system, all throughout our business, at every stage of our strategy, was an important part of our path forward.
In terms of looking at the whole DEI space and your focus in terms of increasing the numbers, in the case of procurement, increasing the procurement spend, how do you communicate that, and communicate it in a way that builds trust? I've read a lot of articles around this issue, interviewed a lot of individuals around this issue, especially in this era. And the real biggest challenge has been one of building trust and ensuring that there is an accountability measurement with employees, with suppliers, stakeholders, and the public at large. How do you manage that process? And where do you think either your organization is or corporate America is in that trust building, accountability measurement area?
Yeah, we're really trying to go after increasing spend within our supplier diversity programs or business supplier programs. And that's really going to be a key focus for us as we move forward. One of our goals is to get to 25% diverse supplier spend by 2025. And we're really excited about that number. We're already at 23% right now. And so our ability to continue to create wealth in Black communities and other diverse communities is a really important part of that. But last July, we decided to go a step further. No different than this call. Angela and I don't know each other well, but we're brothers and sisters in the fight to try and drive change around the DEI space. And so we looked at our supplier base and said, hey, we're, as McDonald's, on this DEI journey. We want you to come along with us. And so what we launched was the mutual commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, where we're partnering directly with our suppliers to really try and move the needle in this space. And we're going to not only have signed up over 300 companies to that mutual commitment, but throughout the year, we're going to host a number of convenings to share best practices and learn from each other. So it's the ripple effect of not only the impact that we can have in the DEI space, but what our supplier communities can have in the DEI space as well. So that balance between increasing spend, which is important and which a lot of companies are working on, but also moving the corporate community through our suppliers in the DEI space is an important part of our strategy moving forward as well.
So Angela, in terms of moving forward, building trust, the accountability measures, what does Nationwide do specifically, and how do you think you're faring on that score?
Yeah, trust is paramount, and Reggie mentioned earlier, using indices, and we use our inclusive indice from our annual culture survey, and that lets us know how trusting and open our associates are feeling about us. And I think the call out that I would make there too, Derek, is that when associates feel very comfortable, as I shared earlier, telling our CEO or telling a leader, hey, I think we have a shortcoming here, that is a true indicator for us that trust is absolutely working. Because if trust wasn't there and they didn't think that they, one, could say something like that, and two, something would be done about it, they wouldn't feel comfortable having those open conversations. And again, these are not in a feedback session. They'll find a way to get the feedback to you. They will find you either in person or send you an email. And so that really speaks, I think, great volumes to the trust that has to exist within an organization to really have an environment where you can make a difference. In regard to supplier diversity, much like Reggie mentioned, we partner with diverse supplier certification agencies to identify new suppliers, sponsor and facilitate professional development of minority suppliers, and education forums as well. Over the past 5 years, we're very proud that we have spent over $1.5 billion in products and services with small and diverse suppliers. And I'm proud of it. It's a start. We will not finish. That number needs to continue to move, and we are absolutely committed to doing that. We know that we have a proven ability, being a nearly 100-year-old company, we have a proven ability to help suppliers generate greater income, and support more jobs and facilitate community development. That's what supplier diversity program is to us at Nationwide, and that's what we're about, making a difference in.
Angela, that's great points that you made. And I want to break up the next question in both one, workplace, and then second, suppliers. The one area that is most important to a lot of our audience is the looking at the elevation of employees. What needs to be put in place, one, for the elevation of African American executives to, one, management positions and eventually senior management positions, if not C-suite positions, and then two, on the supplier side, how do you get say tier 2 suppliers to the prime supplier area? How do you work with all the departments within Nationwide to achieve those goals? Because ultimately that will have the impact that you're seeking on the community side and in terms of closing the wealth gap.
For us, we partner a great deal with our tier 1 suppliers, setting expectations that we want them to partner with tier 2. So they may not meet the qualifications or requirement to partner directly with Nationwide, but those tier 1 suppliers that we do have, we set a clear expectation with them that we expect you to bring in diverse suppliers at that tier 2 and tier 3 levels, the lower levels. And so that's how we get at the tier 2s, Derek. And I think the first part of your question was more internal. So what are we doing internally to promote the advancement of Black and Brown people inside Nationwide? And that is with intentionality. Again, you'll hear that's a reoccurring theme, and purpose. We inspect what we expect, and we hold folks accountable. As I said, an OCO member doesn't want to go back to that same board meeting not having moved the meter You just don't want that. And so that works very well for us. They know that they have to speak to their people plan, and that includes the advancement of people of color to C-suite positions and in leadership. And I'm very proud that in our C-suite, we have 20% ethnic diversity, and we also have 20% female representation. Same way on our board of directors, we have 25% diversity representation from a race and ethnicity perspective and 31% female. So I would also say that it starts at the top, and the top, your leaders, your C-suite, your OCEO, they have to model that behavior as well as your board. And then it permeates down throughout the organization, and the expectation is set that this is what we expect. Sort of this is how we play. These are the rules of engagement, if you will, in our nationwide house.
So and then I imagine to buttress that point, or to buttress that activity, is mentorship and sponsorship. And also I'd like to first focus on how mentorship and sponsorship is manifested, or is it just a natural progression of the, of what is the message from the top in terms of, DEI throughout the organization?
For us, we're very intentional around mentorship and sponsorship. We both have formal programs, very robust formal mentorship programs, and we are focused on people of color to make sure that they have equal access to sponsors and mentors across the enterprise. And we also have informal, and that's primarily through our associate resource groups. Have a ton of informal mentoring and sponsorship that happens there, but more formally and at the top of the house and across, we are very intentional about making sure that any mentorship program or sponsorship program includes diverse representation.
Okay. Reggie, I'd like to first ask you about the supplier diversity/development area. And Angela raised a fascinating point in terms of looking at tier 1 suppliers, bringing along Black and minority tier 2 suppliers. In that case, is there one, does McDonald have an intentional and protege mentorship program that involves tier 1 and tier 2 suppliers? And 2, does McDonald's, dictate, to their prime suppliers that they embrace the same DEI policies that they do for the enterprise as a whole?
Absolutely. I think Angela did a good job of outlining some of the things that we're doing as well. What I would also add to that discussion that I think is really important is sometimes supplier diversity programs really fall in the procurement space and really fall within supply chain, right? And so you think about goods as more of a means by which to do that supplier development, but it has to permeate throughout the entire length of your organization, right? Whether you're talking about the consultants that you're bringing in and other services that you're doing across finance or marketing or HR or whatever part of the organization that you do, are you bringing in diverse suppliers in that aspect as well? It has to be truly holistic as you think about it. And once you make sure that thread that runs throughout the entire organization is also embracing supplier diversity as a way in which they're going to move the needle, then there's that opportunity, as we talked about, to kind of move into not only the tier 1 and tier 2 sort of approach. And then even beyond that, to Angela's point, what are you doing to cultivate new diverse suppliers to add to your bench strength as well within this space? And so that holistic approach has to be the way in which you go about it. And especially from the perspective of, our African-American suppliers as well, making sure that they have a seat at the table, that they get opportunity to participate in RFPs and bid on processes as well. But making sure you're going after this in a very, very holistic way and don't confine it to just the true procurement space, I think is one of the ways that you go after it.
So just as I asked Angela on the workplace equation, how does that manifest itself in terms of, mentorship, sponsorship programs to ensure that we get a larger numbers of African American executives into the senior management and C-suite position, and then eventually on track to become CEO or divisional CEOs.
Mhm.
I think because I would really echo a lot of what Angela said as well. The mentor, the sponsorship piece is important. The succession planning piece and the talent management piece of that is important. But if I can maybe click a level lower, it's also important in what you're teaching, right? I can't speak for everyone, but I know when I first began my career, I was first time corporate. No one in my family had gone through that process before. I didn't have anyone in my family I could talk to about how to dress, how to turn in work, how to do all these things I needed to do to not just survive, but hopefully thrive in a corporate environment. So as we think about these mentorship and sponsorship programs, when we think about the development that we need to do specifically for African-American professionals who are coming through and trying to matriculate up through organizations, it's really kind of digging into what is it that you truly need? Is it exposure? Is it assignments? Is it, what are the things that you really truly need to move forward in your career? And then having, once again, as Angela said, that intentionality to then go after that and address those gaps in a way that's comprehensive. And so that balance between not only do you have the programs, but are you really catering the programs to the specific needs of your African-American professionals within your organization is very important.
So having said that, we you see reports on the, some call it the Great Resignation, some call it the Great Reshuffling, some call it the Great Reset. How do you present that messaging of opportunity and advancement to younger professionals who are opting out of corporate America altogether? A lot of them are looking at more entrepreneurial opportunities or solopreneur opportunities. How do you make the messaging appealing for young Black professionals that McDonald's is the place that they can plant their flag and advance and eventually become, possibly CEO of McDonald's?
Well, I'll be honest and say it's a work in progress, that we don't have it all figured out. We're still growing, in this space as well. But the employee value proposition was probably something that in a lot of ways was used more as a buzzword in the past. And it was something that was created, but maybe not as marketed as it could internally within an organization. But I would say now more than ever, you have to have a reason why someone should stay. Because it's not like there's not opportunity out there. There certainly is. And it's not like people aren't getting, offers out there. Sometimes, offers that are astronomical, to be quite honest, that are out there and available. And so really, yes, absolutely. Everything's on the table. Yeah, if I'd have had that, maybe my career would have been a little bit different. But the bottom line is, if you can't really sit down and have an employee know the reason why they should stay, whether that's career path and opportunities, as you mentioned, whether it's monetary, whether, once again, whatever is important to them, maybe it's because they value your company's values and they can align and see themselves within that. But that's going to be, I think, as we think about not only 2022 and beyond, something very important, especially for this current and next generation to really understand is, why should I be here? I could be anywhere. But if you can't, and they can't answer the question on why they should be with your organization, then you're missing the boat. And we are, of course, in the process of making sure that our own employees understand that. But once again, being really frank, it's a work in progress.
Okay. Angela, I'd like for you to speak to that. We know that, nationwide, as well as a number of corporations actively recruit Black professionals, but there's a real retention challenge these days, and that needs to be addressed because that may be your future leadership challenge. How do you address that, through DEI and through the message that's communicated to young professionals, the young millennials, the young Gen Zers, and others that have, gone through this wave of looking at their options and have opted out of corporate America?
Derek, what I would say to that is, we say if you can see it, you can be it. I was at a recruiting event at an HBCU late last year, and we spent quite a bit of time talking about that. And me being a career nationwider, I could see myself very early on in my career at all levels of the organization. And so I knew if I wanted to thrive and have a career at Nationwide, that Nationwide was a place for me, because even in the C-suite, I could see myself. And so I think a lot of it gets back to that representation. A lot of times, especially the millennials, they don't know that this is a place for them, or that they can rise to the C-suite if they don't see that representation there. So I think representation at all levels of the organization and being visible to minority recruits is it's critical, because if they don't see it, then they think that it's not a place for them and that they can't aspire to that level, or they can only maybe get to middle management and they can't go higher than that. So I think having representation and having that visible representation and talking about it when you're going to the recruiting events and showing that we do have diverse representation, as a person that looks just like you at every level of the organization, that's inspiring, I have found, to the millennials, and they feel like, wow, this is a place for me. And Reggie mentioned a value proposition, and that's part of a value proposition, having a great place to work with great opportunity, great advancement opportunities. That's the value proposition that makes a difference to, I think, Black and Brown recruiting students alike.
It's been a great conversation. I have two more questions, and you talked about value proposition. Along with that, that's extremely important, is a sense of belonging. And in order to create an environment like that, you have to have buy-in from all employees in terms of move a corporate culture. And I'd like both you and Reggie to share with us, what are your focus, your strategies, your engagement policy around white allyship? It's extremely important to develop white allies in terms of moving forward, diversity within an organization. And from your vantage point, how does that manifest itself at Nationwide, and how should that manifest itself in corporate America?
It's going to take all of us, Derek, is how it manifests itself. And we have real talk, we call it real conversations about that, and say that this isn't just a Black problem or a Hispanic problem or an Asian problem. We have to have all of us, white men and women, involved and actively engaged in this to really solve the problem. And so we have those real conversations, encourage the real conversations, and create a safe environment where we can have those real talks. And so you can ask questions that you may not feel comfortable asking in a larger audience, but have one-on-one diverse conversations with your peers and partners. And it's really through that real talk and getting them comfortable and calling out that you are a part of this. It's not a problem that Black people have to solve. We can't solve it alone. It takes all of us. And so continuing to reinforce that and having the open and transparent conversations, and again, holding folks accountable. It comes back to that accountability piece.
Okay.
Yeah. And I'll just echo what Angela said as well, and not try and reshape it. She said it in such a great way. What I'll add on top of that is we're in 100+ markets outside of the U.S., and the way diversity is defined in Dubai or Asia or Europe is different, but yet we still have to go out and truly drive equity and inclusion in those markets just as much as we have to do it here in the US. And so finding that balance, to Angela's point, where everyone has a role to really drive diversity, equity, inclusion within this company. And to that point, every employee, regardless of where they work within the company, has to feel welcome, comfortable, and safe when they're here. Sometimes that's psychological safety. And so do you have that culture that provides that within your doors? Sometimes it's around equity and opportunity. Once again, as Angela mentioned as well, but that we have to do it for everyone throughout the company, not just one group or that group, but for groups where we know there is a historical gap, we have to lean in a little bit more and make sure that we're providing those tools and resources in order to make sure that they feel included, as we mentioned before. within your doors as well. So it's a difficult task for all chief diversity officers, is doing the work for some, for many, and for all. But it's the task that we welcome every day we come into work.
Well, as we close, and that's a great segue, provide us with 3 strategies or 3 areas of focus for our audience, because you said that everybody needs to be engaged in driving the DEI agenda and to enhancing the culture of the company. What is the role that our audience can play in terms of, helping you, reinforce DEI policy and ultimately position the company as it's intended to be, both internally and externally? I'll start with you, Reggie, and then I'll finish with Angela.
The first thing that I would say is important as we think about just how we move the needle forward in DEI, is one that's really focused in on leadership. I think all of our leaders, regardless of what position you play within your company, have a role to play to move DEI forward, a little bit like we talked about in the last question. And so the challenge I give to leaders is simply this: look at your network. And if your network is homogeneous, then go meet some diverse individuals and it doesn't matter what space or field you're in, marketing, finance, IT, doesn't matter. If your network all looks the same, then you have some work to do to diversify your network. I think secondly, whether you're an individual contributor or a supervisor or a leader, once again, we all have a role to play. So what are you doing to really give other people within your organization a voice, to make sure that other people have a seat at the table beyond just yourself, to sometimes give up power, which I know is sometimes a difficult thing, to allow someone else an opportunity to be heard and feel heard within your organization. And then the third and final thing that I would say, and I think this one is very, very important, it's really around, we said it multiple times through this call, intentionality. Inclusion just doesn't happen by chance. Everyone has to ensure that they're doing their part every single day. And once again, just because you're a person of color doesn't mean that you're out of that equation, that you're just a recipient of that. And so I would say, as an African-American professional myself, is what are you doing to help put other people on? Whether it's people externally, people within your company, how are you also sharing information and knowledge so that next generation can also matriculate up through the organization as well? Once again, we all have a role to play to make sure that your respective organizations feel included.
Angela?
Well, I think you'll be able to tell that Reggie and I are both definitely in the CDO space because I have very similar top 3s. So it's being that ally. Each one of my 3, I think, are around intention, but it's be intentional about being an ally. Be that voice for the voiceless. Second, I would say is continue to learn cultural differences. Make sure that your trusted 10 or your board of advisors is diverse. As Reggie said, if you're made up of all females on your trusted advisors, then you probably want to add some males to that. If they all look like you probably want to add a different ethnic or racial background, but make sure that you are constantly growing and developing culturally. And then lastly, I would say is figure out what it is you're passionate about around DE&I and go after it. I think too often folks kind of wait for, especially if you're in corporate, for your company or your corporation to say, hey, this is what we're doing. But there's nothing that prevents you from following your own personal passion. Do your own research locally, figure out what it is you're passionate about, and then go make it happen.
Wow. Angela, Reggie, thank you so much for joining me. This has been a great conversation, and what you've communicated to us is why DEI must be a business imperative, but also it's extremely important for our audience to embrace it as a means of enhancing their lives from both a professional and a personal standpoint in terms of increasing their network of diverse individuals, as well as getting to know the policies within the corporation and then playing a role in helping to drive them forward as your allies. So thank you for participating in our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Summit. Really enjoyed this conversation and look forward to meeting up with you again in the next few months to see if we've further moved the needle as it relates to DEI in corporate America and specifically your companies.
Thank you so much, Derek.
Thank you, Derek.